Hello and welcome. Very pleased tonight to introduce you to my guest. I'm speaking with Lori Saroya. She is the Executive Director of CAIR Minnesota, and CAIR stands for the Council on American-Islamic Relationships. She's the Executive Director of the Minnesota chapter. She's also the co-founder of this organization, and I'm going to have her describe the mission and some of its wonderful goals. But before I turn it over to her, I want to tell you a bit more about Lori, because she is one of the young, outstanding Minnesota leaders that we have here in our state. You got your undergraduate degree at St. Kate's, and then got your law degree, Juris Doctorate from Hamlin. And you went to the weekend program, which sounds challenging for a doctorate. When she graduated, she got the very prestigious John Wesley Leadership and Service Award there. She is on the council of the Minnesota Board of Nonprofits. She was recently appointed to the Minnesota Judicial Branch's Committee for Equality and Justice. She has an exciting fellowship from the Bush Foundation, in which she is studying for 2 years and also continuing her work with CAIR. She was named one of the 10 outstanding young Minnesotans by the Minnesota JCs in 2012. She was recognized as a Facing Race ambassador by the St. Paul Foundation. She's been named to the National Muslim Heroes list. So many awards here, the St. Kate's Alumni Award and the Hanson Peace and Justice Award. I don't know that award. Can you tell us a bit about that one?
Well, it's for students who are committed to social justice and volunteering and activism in their communities.
And so given by St. Kate's?
No, it's the Hanson Foundation, and I received that while I was actually a law student.
Oh, okay.
Hamlin.
So for students all over the country?
It's for students, and mostly, for students that engage in some kind of a project or community service initiative.
Okay, well, congratulations on all these amazing awards. I'm sure people are interested in how you came to found CAIR, but let's step back even further in your life and talk a little bit about how you got to Minnesota and where you grew up, which was Iowa, but tell us more about your early days and some of your childhood challenges.
Yeah, well, I am the daughter of immigrants. My parents came here in the late 60s, and they settled in a really small town in Iowa, in southern Iowa. And they chose this town because, my dad traveled a lot, and they felt it would be really, small and safe, where my mom could stay home with her
middle of the country.
Yes, and so, and it was a really nice place to grow up. But I think what they didn't really take into account was that there weren't any other people like us. There weren't any Muslims in the community. There wasn't any diversity in our small town. And because of that, there was a lot of ignorance. There was a lot of fear and confusion about who we were and just how we were perceived in the community. So I remember early on, there were, just a lot of incidents that kept happening to my family in terms of hate messages being left on our voicemail, vandalism, just things like that. And as a kid, you kind of, and you brush it off. You kind of, you just don't want to address it, don't want to deal with it, and just, because you want to be accepted, you want to live in your hometown.
Of course, but for your parents, it must have been very hard, very disappointing.
I think they focus on the positive. I think with any, immigrant, family, I think it's true that, when they come here, they come for a better life, they want a better experience. And so they really focus on the positives, and there were, a lot of good things happening in that town. We had really great neighbors, we had, a really great school, a good education. Iowa has one of the top education systems. So we did get benefit from our community, from our town. But at the same time, I think that instilled in me just this, need to stand up for people's rights. My parents, whenever something like this happened, whenever there was an act of discrimination, they were very dismissive about it. You know, they would always call it, I remember the word that my mom used a lot was a coincidence. Everything was a coincidence. You know, somebody calls our house, it's a coincidence, you know, and so then I think after a while, you know, being a child, you realize, no, it's not a coincidence. You know, there's something going on here, and there have to be consequences. People have to be held accountable for their behavior. And I think that's kind of what led me to law school, to pursue civil rights and make a career out of this as well. And
when you were in 7th grade, you took a really big step. Tell the audience what you did at that age. I mean, 12 years old, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, my family moved to another city, in Iowa City, and so I wanted to do more to educate my community about who Muslims were and what my faith really is. You know, a lot of times, you know, we see other people defining who we are as American Muslims. So I started a project to organize a conference in Iowa. The Iowa Conference on Islam was what it was called.
At the college in town,
yeah,
right?
Yep. So I was actually a senior in high school when I started the project. And it really took off. You know, we had thousands of people that came. And what I realized were a lot of people just didn't know. So it's not that they were hateful or bigoted. They just didn't know any better. And they wanted to learn about Muslims and their neighbors. So I think that really set me off in this career and got me more interested in how we can, as a community, promote dialogue and encourage, you know, people of all faiths to come together and learn about one another.
So that experience really was part of the evolution of CAIR, obviously.
Yeah.
Just to backtrack another question, your father was from Pakistan, you said earlier to me. Where was your mother from?
They were both from Pakistan.
She was too, okay. Well, then CAIR Minnesota was started by you and your husband in 2007. So it's 7 years old only. What was your mission? I know there's a national organization, but how would you define the mission of our chapter here in Minnesota?
Yeah.
And then compare that to the national council.
Yeah, so CAIR Minnesota is a civil rights and legal advocacy organization. So our local chapter really serves people who are facing discrimination. And a lot of the cases we get are from Muslims in Minnesota, but we also see cases from other racial, religious, and ethnic minorities. You know, we'll see cases from Hindus, Sikhs, Arab Christians, you know, people who are discriminated against because they're perceived as Muslims. So they're going through the same challenges and struggles as the Muslim community, and we're there to advocate for them and, you know, just really protect their civil rights. So I think that's the main distinction. In Minnesota, we are primarily, you know, our number one focus is civil rights and legal advocacy. And, you know, there are 35 chapters all over the U.S.
Oh, so not every state.
Not every state, but most states, the larger states, have a chapter, and each state has its own, you know, expertise. Some focus more on immigration law, others are more focused on, you know, international relations. So every chapter kind of has, you know, looks at what that community needs and models their chapter, you know, with that information in mind.
Do you get feedback at all from abroad, from the Middle East, how people view what CAIR is doing here in the States?
Well, in Minnesota, our focus is entirely on Muslims in Minnesota. So we don't do anything abroad unless there is a link to Minnesota. So sometimes we'll get cases where there's an individual who's stranded abroad. You know, they fly to visit relatives and then they're put on a no-fly list, or they have some kind of challenge coming back into the country. So those are some of the cases that we'll sometimes take on in terms of helping, you know, people abroad. But other than that, our work is entirely focused on Minnesota.
I was thinking, though, that people abroad would be impressed, I'm guessing, with what you're attempting to do and doing.
Yeah, definitely.
Feeling it's needed, I'm sure.
No, that's true. We get visitors actually from the State Department that come and visit our office on a regular basis. And, you know, and they're not just from, you know, Muslim majority countries. We have people from France and, you know, Europe, like all over the world, basically. And they're extremely impressed. And not just by our work, but even by our legal system and how we have these laws in our country where we can, you know, protect people's religious beliefs and, you know, and stand up for that.
Are there parallel organizations in the European countries that are doing similar things?
Yeah, there are. There are definitely other you know, Muslim civil rights legal advocacy organizations all over the world.
Some of the core principles of CAIR, we're going to put on the screen just a few of them. There are actually maybe a dozen, but I picked 3 out, and I'd like to have you just comment on them briefly. But I thought they were so helpful in terms of understanding some of your goals and the mission. You support free enterprise, freedom of religion, and freedom of expression. Now that sounds very basic, but the very fact that it's a principle must mean that it's something you have to fight a bit for, correct?
Right, definitely. I think that's why we exist. We want to protect the people's ability to practice their faith as they see fit. And our law, is very clear on that. Individuals' sincerely held religious belief is protected, whether it's at school, in the workplace. And so we come in as advocates, as attorneys, to come and advocate for that person's right. Regardless of, whether we agree with it or not, that's besides the point. But we are working on that principle that in this country we have freedom of religion, and we will advocate for people's right to practice their faith.
It sounds very basic, but of course we know it's extremely important. Let's put the screen up again, and the next one says you're committed to protecting the civil rights of all Americans regardless of faith. So when you define as an attorney, as a lawyer, civil rights, compare and contrast that if you would.
So we get cases from people facing a whole variety of issues. The majority of the casework that we actually see in our office are employment discrimination cases. So there's 2 main categories: people who are facing hostile work environments, and then the other category is people who are denied religious accommodations. And so this comes into this employment discrimination category. And then we also see issues in the school setting, with students, Muslim, and it's also racial, religious, ethnic minorities. We get cases from African-American students that are being harassed and bullied, from Somali American students, and even Native American students will sometimes call our office for help. So it's really, just serving people that are facing these issues, because our laws, again, are clear that students have the right to go to school and not face harassment based on their, their race and ethnicity. So that's where we come in and help them, advocate for them.
I want to come back later in the show and ask more about bullying, because we've seen some movement in progress in terms of defining it and responding to it, but there's still quite a ways to go, don't you feel? And then the very last one, you condemn all acts of violence against civilians by any individual, group, or state. And I thought that was important to put up, given some people's confusion and some of the misconceptions about ISIS. Is it driving you crazy having this big issue now to explain and to separate yourself from?
Definitely. I think the biggest challenge is that it's not the first time we've gone through it. It's as if we take one step forward and then ISIS comes about and then we take 10 steps backwards. And then we have to, redefine ourselves as a community. And I think that's our biggest challenge. There are people who don't understand our faith, who don't, like ISIS, doesn't speak for our community. They're condemned by Muslims and, not just American Muslims, but Muslims abroad. And then people don't know that. I think that's our biggest challenge. How do we get this message out there that this is this violent, horrible, extremist organization that does not speak for Muslims? And that's a big part of our mission. We do a lot of outreach and education in our community to get that message out there.
What do you feel is the most effective way to get that message out? Do we just need to hear it over and over? Is that are there any techniques that seem to work better than others?
Yeah, I think what we found is that if an individual has a relationship with a Muslim, whether it's a coworker, they have a friend at school who's Muslim, a neighbor who's Muslim, any kind of interaction, no matter how little it is, and it could be just somebody at the grocery store that they chat with every day. So that is the biggest thing. When they know somebody who is Muslim.
That one-to-one.
Right, that one-to-one interaction that can negate everything that they're seeing on the media, everything that they're hearing and reading about in the newspaper. If they have an actual example of a good Muslim, and so that it speaks louder than whatever actions somebody else is committing in the name of Islam.
As you said, the frustration, though, of having made progress since 9/11, and then to have this spring up, it's got to be extremely challenging to kind of keep explaining the same issues, but with different players, so to speak.
Right. It is. It's very frustrating. I think, I wish, I hope, that we can be at a point, as a community at some point where people understand us. I think that's the biggest challenge, because when things like this happen in other communities, we don't see the same kind of confusion and fear. For example, the Westboro Baptist Church, for example, when they go out and protest funerals, people don't associate that with Christianity or the Bible. There's a sense of understanding that this is outside of Christianity. What their actions don't represent Christians.
It's a splinter group, we would say, or a fundamentalist group that isn't mainstream.
So it's seen like that. Even the KKK, even though they're, advocating, on behalf of the Bible, they say, they're people of faith. People have enough knowledge, enough information to know, no, that is not Christianity. That they do not speak for Christians. So I hope and pray that is where the Muslim community will be at, someday soon, hopefully, where people see these extremist groups, see these people committing horrible, things in the name of our faith, and they know enough about our faith and our people to know that this is outside of Islam. This is not what Muslims stand for. This is not what Islam is. And so I'm hopeful. I'm definitely an optimist, and I believe that we will get to that point someday.
I think we will too, and the world being smaller because of social media, in a way, I think has got to help, don't you?
Definitely, yeah. We're seeing the Nobel Peace Prize was recently awarded, to Malala, a young Muslim woman, and about half of the Nobel Peace Prize has gone to Muslims in just the past few years. It has, and so even just getting information like that out there, in Minnesota, our Keith Ellison is Muslim, and we have lots of accomplished doctors and attorneys and business people that are Muslims in our community doing wonderful, great things. And I think once people start seeing that, I think it's going to help a lot.
The young girl, what is her name?
Malala.
Malala, yeah. As I told you, I'm bad with pronunciation. It must have just been a thrill for you to see her win that prize.
Yeah, definitely. I think, anytime, we see a young Muslim woman, doing something amazing, and definitely that's a great thing for our community.
All those reasons. Have you ever met her?
I have not.
No,
so
that would
hope
be.
To, though,
yes, I bet. Well, as you said, one of your main focuses with CAIR is in the workplace and discrimination. And I read that you have done training that's involved 30,000 Minnesotans going to corporations. Are you able to continue doing that with, you don't have a big staff, that's a lot of training.
Yeah.
Lori.
Yeah, we do a lot of training. So our employer trainings are basically diversity trainings. And so we have an annual conference that we do for employers. And also we just started one for law enforcement because we were getting a lot of cases of profiling and some misunderstanding there. So these are seminars that are sold out. Every year we do these. And it just shows again people want to learn. They want to be better at what they're doing and at their jobs. And we teach them introduction to Islam and Muslims, or introduction to Somali culture. We talk about unconscious bias. We talk about what are some best practices and give them some really good examples. What are some companies right here in Minnesota that have figured it out, that have a really positive relationships with their Muslim employees, and what are those practices? What are they doing to provide a positive experience for Muslims and other racial, religious, and ethnic minorities in the workplace?
What are a couple of the success stories in terms of what's really going right here?
Yeah, well, I think some of the successes are, if people can prevent the casework, if they are really actively pursuing options, where they are providing their employees a break for prayer. I think that's sometimes a case that we see a lot in our office because employers just don't know enough about the Muslim prayer. Muslims pray 5 times a day throughout the day at specific times. So if an employee will come to them and ask for a prayer break, they'll say, oh, just, hold off until your lunch break. But they can't always do that because it doesn't coincide with their timing for prayer. So just even education like that, just so much, in preventing these cases, because by the time the cases come to us, they have escalated to a point where it should not have gone. It should not be a lawsuit. These things can easily be prevented, as the law is
more
clear.
Education.
Right. The law is
dialogue.
really clear, in terms of religious accommodation. And, the employer should provide, the accommodation unless it's an undue burden. And typically, the prayer accommodation, it's just a few minutes. It's not considered an undue burden on
Besides breaks from work, studies do say people are more efficient if they take breaks. I mean, that's a very non-pertinent in one way, but it's a side benefit, isn't it?
Right. And we've seen companies that actually provide an on-site prayer space. So, for example,
that's ideal.
Yeah. So Muslims, our holy day is Friday. As opposed to, Sunday or Saturday. We don't have Friday off. So when it's time for the Muslim community to go to their sermon on Fridays, if they choose to, they have to leave work. They need that 30-minute, 1-hour break. And so some employers will actually provide a, meditation room or prayer room on site for the Muslim employees to, if they choose to congregate and do that prayer and then come right back to work. And we've seen a lot of great things like that.
Have you found or felt that there was discrimination in hiring Muslims here in Minnesota because of some of the misconceptions?
Yeah.
Do they have a higher rate of being unemployed than average?
Not necessarily. I think the difficulty in that is it's difficult to prove. So the cases that we are able to take on are cases where during the interview, religion is brought up. We've had cases where employers have asked people what their religion is, what their national origin is, and then they don't, if the interview abruptly ends or, they don't get the job. We've had Muslim women go in for interviews and they're asked, are you going to take the hijab off if you work here? And so things like that are illegal. The employer cannot make a decision based on one's, religion.
Right.
So those kinds of cases we have been able to successfully advocate.
But as you say, there may be cases that are just under the
definitely.
rug.
Yeah, there are. We recently had one case where it was one woman that came to us, with a complaint about not being allowed to wear the hijab in the workplace. And we took the case and we found it was actually 30 other women that were also told that they could not wear the hijab in the workplace.
In that
same company. And
same
so
company.
this often happens, where one person will come to us and then we'll see that it's not just this one person, that's being affected by this issue. It's a big problem in the company.
So the brave person who comes really benefits everybody.
Yes.
We just have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you about flying because I read somewhere that you are on a checklist before you are able to fly. And tell us a bit what that feels like.
Yeah.
And
well, I've actually been removed, so that's good news.
Good.
So, I think the problem, so there's the no-fly list and the watch list. And the problem with these lists is, they can put anyone on it and they can take anyone off of it, and you just don't know. There's really no process to go through it, unless you file a lawsuit, and then it takes several years to go through that. So what would happen with me was every time I flew, I would have 4 S's on my boarding pass, and that means, extra security. How I, ended up on this list, I don't know. And I basically went to our Department of Justice and I brought this to their attention.
Here in Minnesota.
Right, and then I was taken off. So for me, personally, it was actually an easier method than it is for our community, because most people don't have access to the, to high officials in the DOJ that can do this for them.
Would your title, executive position with the council, would that have put you on just that awareness? And I mean, it shouldn't, but
I think that's what took me off. I think it was because of my title that I was able to go approach them and be taken off the list. Whereas, if it was another community member, they probably, wouldn't be taken off the list, would still be going through that process. And so I think it's very humiliating. It was, I think it was probably 15-minute delays that I experienced at the airport. But, I think it's very humiliating. I remember every time I would be asked that question, we need to do extra security checks on you, and they would always ask me, would you prefer to do this in private? And my response would be, no. I want everyone to see what
that
you are
I am
doing.
being picked out
Right.
of the crowd
I want
here.
it. I want. It's more embarrassing for them, you know, to have me, a Muslim woman in a headscarf, stand there and go through this extra security. So definitely, you know, I think, and I'm somebody, you know, who teaches other people what their rights are. You know, I exerted every right that I have in these situations.
Well,
so,
good for you, but
definitely.
a lot of people wouldn't
Right.
feel as open with they. We want to give you some resource information here now, so I'm breaking to have you take note of this. If you would like to learn more about what the Council is doing, the Council on American-Islamic Relations in Minnesota, go to www.cairmn.com. And then if you just want to communicate that way, there is an address here for you, info@mn.cair.com. The website I found very helpful and just full of good information and very, very helpful. So
Good.
check that out. Well, we've got just 1 minute left. Children growing up now in Minnesota, I know you said there, of course, is some bullying. Do you think it's getting better since you've been working with CAIR?
Yeah, definitely. You know, we've had several cases with the U.S. Department of Education where they have stepped in to Minnesota. Actually, just recently, the South High School, you know, case where there were 300 students that got into a fight, Somali American and African American.
Right.
So we are seeing progress. You know, so they came in and there was a settlement agreement, and now with the anti-bullying law that is going into place, you know, I'm definitely optimistic that there will be positive change for all students.
Well, that's good, and congratulations on the good work you are doing, and
Thank you.
continued success.
Thanks so much.
It's been great meeting you.
Thank you.
I've been talking with one of our real outstanding Minnesota leaders. I think you can see why, Lori Saroya. And thank you for being with Lori and I. I'll be back again next week. Until then, have a good week.